In this demonstration you will learn how to create a customer's view model. Let's switch to Visual Studio. Here I've opened the Customers App project. In the starter project for this module, you find here a model folder that contains the customer class. As you can see, it defines the properties ID, first name, last name and isDeveloper. There is also a data folder that contains the customer data provider class. In this file, you see an iCustomerDataProvider interface that has a getAllAsync method that returns a task of iEnumerable of customer. Then there is the Customer Data Provider class that implements this interface. As you can see, the getAllAsync method simulates a bit of server work with this task delay here, and then it returns a new list of customer. Instead of hardcoding the customers here, you could, for example, access a database or a web API. Now, let's go to the Solution Explorer and let's add a view model for the customers view that uses this data provider to load customers. So let's right-click the project and let's select from the context menu Add New Folder. I call this folder View Model. Now let's right-click this View Model folder and let's select from the context menu Add Class. As you want to create a view model for the customers view, let's call the view model Customers View Model and let's add it to the project. Now first, let me make this a public class. Next, let's provide a customer's property so that you can bind the list view in the user interface to that property. So let's use here the prop snippet. Let's press the tab key to close IntelliSense and let's press it again to insert the snippet for a property. Let's make this property of type Observable Collection of Customer. I press Escape to close IntelliSense and I add a closing angle bracket. Now let's press Tab and let's call the property Customers. I hit Enter to confirm this. Now I press Ctrl- to add a using directive for Wired Brain Coffee Customers App Model. This namespace contains the customer class. I press Ctrl- again to add a using for System Collections Object Model, which is the namespace of this Observable Collection class. The Observable Collection class raises a collection changed event when you add or remove customers from the collection. The data binding in WPF subscribes to that event to update the user interface accordingly. This means every time you have a collection that can change, you should use an observable collection so that the data binding gets notified. Now here, let's make this a read-only property and let's initialize it with a new observable collection. Now let me put the cursor on the usings and let's press Ctrl- here to remove the unnecessary usings. Now you have actually that customer's property and the next step is to fill that property with data. To do this, let's use the data provider. So let's create here a constructor with a CTOR snippet. I press the tab key twice and on that constructor, let's define a parameter of type iCustomerDataProvider. I press Ctrl- to add a using directive for the Wired Brain Coffee Customers App data namespace that contains this data provider interface. Let's call the parameter CustomerDataProvider and I press Ctrl- to create and assign that parameter to a field. I prefer that fields start with an underscore, so let's add an underscore here and then you don't have to use the this keyword in the constructor. Here I use the interface and not the class itself because that way you could provide another implementation of this interface to the view model when you want to unit test it. Now let's scroll down in this view model and let's create here a public method that returns a task and let's call it loadAsync. In this method, let's create a customer's variable and then let's await the customer data provider's getAllAsync method. As you can see, Visual Studio automatically added the async keyword to the method. Now let's create here a for each loop. Let's use the for each snippet and let's press the tab key twice And let's say here, for each customer in customers, I hit enter. And now let's use here our customers observable collection, and let's add the customer to that collection. Now you can see when you hover the customers variable, Visual Studio says that it may be null here. So let's include here an if statement, and let's just check if customers is not null. And if that's the case, let's do here the for each loop. In addition, before we load the data, I want to ensure that the data was not loaded yet. So let me include here an if statement, and let's just check if there is any customer in our observable collection. I'll press Ctrl- to add a using directive for the system link namespace that contains that any method, and if we have any customer, let's just jump out of this load async method. Now this customers view model is implemented. In the next clip, let's use it in the customers view.